Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Julie White, and today we will look at the comic book industry and how it has changed and is still changing through emerging media like movies. With me, I have an English professor at Cal State Northridge, Dr. Charles Hatfield, who teaches a comic book and graphic novel class. Next, a store owner of a new comic book store, Galaxy of Comics, Warren Jaycox. And finally, a writer and creator of a new comic book, Z-Blade XX, Steve Palmer. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Julie.
Dr. Hatfield, what do you think people are looking for in a comic book?
Well, they're looking for some kind of reading experience, and they're looking for an unusual reading experience that is fun to gaze at, as well as engaging to read. And that's always a double-edged thing. You will be gazing at comics and you'll be reading them. Sometimes I ogle comics after I've read them. I go back and look at pages. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'll go back and admire the way time and space and things are folded in, and how the page becomes a way of communicating, but also a beautiful thing in itself. There's just something about reading comics that is different from other kinds of reading, and it's a gateway to reading for a lot of people when they're young, and then it remains an alternate kind of reading on a parallel track in a way from other kinds of reading. We're doing my grad course right now on comics and the novel, and we go from reading novels full of prose to reading comic books short and long, and kind of going in between those two things. We're so aware that those are two different kinds of reading. That's what I like in it anyway, and that's what a lot of my students seem to be getting from it.
So Steve, what draws you to picking up a comic book and reading it?
Usually when I pick up a comic book and I start reading it, I want to be engaged by a really good story. If it's an already existing comic, anything from Batman, Spider-Man, Green Lantern, I don't just necessarily like seeing more of the same. There are certain themes and all those classic characters that a fan will expect if they're going to shell out the money, pick up the comic or the graphic novel, open page one and say, well, here I go. You don't want to deter off in too much of any direction that's really going to irritate the fan base, but you want a story that is going to grow a character and evolve the reader. I think I'd like to see villains from the past in certain like Marvel and DC books, you know, that you haven't seen in 10 years. Continuity. I am a huge believer in continuity and canon, but don't bring them back just to throw them in there and say, hey, they're back. Well, that's great, but I'd like to see connection through stories of their past. I think it's really neat if a new hot writer is able to take certain stories that another writer or another artist have done, you know, in 15 or so years past, and as opposed to saying, well, you know, I remember when they wrote this book, and I didn't like the direction they went, so I'm going to ignore this whole subplot they went, and we'll never explain it. That irritates me. I want to pick up, and I want to see what the writer and artist have done. It's like, okay, you didn't like that. What did you do to that character? Or what did you do to that storyline to kind of bring it into the fold, maybe make an explanation of it? I like the creative part of me likes to see that challenge of the writer and artist. You know, what did they do with it?
Now, looking at the history, you know, comic books have been around for ages, it seems like. Where did they initially come from, Dr. Hatfield?
They came out of comic strips in the newspapers. I mean, comic books happened when the way that newspapers handle comic strips and the way that the old pulp magazines handle storytelling, when those two things kind of get slapped together, and that happens, I mean, it finally happens in a way that lasts, in a way that sticks and develops an industry in the mid-1930s, so that takes a while. You've got the dime novels and pulp magazines that tell stories in words, and often do that with continuing characters like The Shadow or Nick Carter or Doc Savage, and then you have the comic strips from newspapers, which sometimes tell jokes or sometimes have continuing stories, and when you put those two approaches together, the comic books grow up as kind of a marginal industry at first. It's really a satellite of other industries. It's either a satellite of newspapers, that's how comic strips started in America more than a century ago, and then they're a satellite of other magazines. So it comes out of that. It's just opportunism, entrepreneurs, people looking for ways to combine existing things and make something new. 70 years ago, a little bit more, is when the first comic books came out in this country.
Now, going back to comic strips, I believe one of the first comic strips was Popeye, and it actually started in what was known as Thimble Theater. Could you maybe explain this more?
I'm not sure I know that much about it, but I do know, yeah, that Popeye emerged as a character in that strip, and essentially became a real fan favorite, and the publisher basically picked up on that and really, kind of ran with it. I think I may be wrong on this, but I believe by 33 they had animated shorts that were just Popeye. Forget about the rest of Thimble Theater and all of that, but just Popeye, because he was so popular. And yeah, they just picked up on the fact that the fans. This happens a lot in comics. They pick up on the fact that fans really enjoyed a specific character. Took it and said, hey, let's do something.
Comics have had this relationship to the movies. You mentioned that at the outset of the program, but they've had it for a long time. And Thimble Theater was an imitation of movie serials, of continuing movie stories. That's what it was. It's kind of a comical imitation of how the movies were operating back in 1919, 1920. And that went on for almost a decade before Popeye showed up, and he sort of hijacked the whole strip. Right? Not many people know that Olive Oyl, his girlfriend, was around for like 9 or 10 years before Popeye showed up. And he kind of hijacked the strip, and he was sort of I wouldn't say exactly a superhero, but kind of a brawling, superhuman character, maybe a precursor for Superman and all the rest.
Now, moving out of the history, I'm looking around at the comic books you brought in, and most of them are what you call graphic novels, and they're becoming more popular. How are graphic novels different than the traditional, say, 40-page comic books?
I mean, what I tell people is that that graphic novels and trade paperbacks are compilations, typically compilations of existing comic books, floppies, whatever you want to call them. If you've got a 12-issue, much like Watchmen, if you've got a 12-issue, series like Watchmen that came out in 1985, 86, the trade paperback, the graphic novel Watchmen, is basically just the compilation of those 12 issues with a few extras thrown in, some insights as to what the author was thinking when he wrote it, what the penciler and the inker was doing at the time. There's a lot of that. Sometimes a graphic novel, in fact, I believe the pure definition of a graphic novel is something that has not been in print. That a trade paperback is a compilation of existing material, and a graphic novel is actually a fresh new product that's never seen print before. It's an emerging market even still. I mean, 20 years ago, I don't think the comic book market would have even ever thought that this would be something that would be a good portion of the comic book industry.
Art Spiegelman said that when he set out to create a graphic novel, he just wanted to make a comic that you would have to have a bookmark for. That was the idea, that you would have to go back and find your place and maybe start again. And that's been more and more the ideal of the comic book business in these last 15, 20 years. More an ideal than a fact until maybe the last 10 years or so, and it's become increasingly a fact. So a comic you can have a bookmark in.